There was a great rattling of bones as dried and dead bones first were covered with sinews and muscles and skin, and then that pile of dead bones came to life. No, this isn't a horror movie. This is a vision that the prophet Ezekiel had. And sometimes to see visions, you have to be drunk. Yep, I mean that. You have to be drunk. A lot of people, when they heard Ezekiel speak, would have said, he's got to be drunk. He's got to be high on something. And Ezekiel was high on something. But it wasn't manufactured things that he was high on. Ezekiel had this powerful spiritual moment where he could see what so many others could not. Ezekiel was a prophet during the time of the captivity of the people of Israel into the land of the Babylonians. And Ezekiel, one of the priests at that time, was carried along with all of the rulers and all of the people of any importance, most of the men, many of the women, some of the elderly and children, and more of the poorer people were left in place in ancient Israel. The rest, including Ezekiel, were taken into captivity. They were definitely in a very tough spot. But good news comes to these ancient people. Good news that God was going to put a right spirit and a heart of healing within them, a heart of peace. The promises to the ancient people were that the land was to be theirs, the land that had been taken away. And we have to be very, very careful today not to confuse the promises of land to an ancient people thousands and thousands of years ago and present-day Israel. Two very separate realities. But in Ezekiel chapter 37, faith was at an all-time low. It could be said that faith was dead. Trust in God's promises were forgotten. Faith was like a valley of dead bones. And Ezekiel hears God in this vision that he has. Ezekiel hears God ask a question. Can these bones live? And in this vision, in this dream that Ezekiel has, Ezekiel says to God, God, only you know. So prophesy to them, says God. Prophesy to them, and Ezekiel does. And there was a rattling sound as these dry bones came together, and as we said, were covered with tendons and muscles and skin. But it wasn't finished yet, because as these dead bodies then lie there covered in skin, all in a heap, they were not moving. They were not breathing. There was no life within them. And God says to Ezekiel, prophesy again that the breath of the winds from the four corners of the earth should enter into these dead bodies, that they may live. And so Ezekiel prophesied again. And God did what God does again in the mystery that is God. In this vision, these dead bodies came to life. And as Ezekiel told his vision to others, there would have been many in that inner circle of people who still tried to recognize that they were people of God. They would have said to Ezekiel, there is no doubt, but you are drunk. These things can't happen. Can't you see all around? There is no hope for us. All is lost. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar by name, has defeated us. God is gone. God is dead. But Ezekiel continues to prophesy. And as Ezekiel tells it, the breath of God, that kind of Pentecostal moment way back before Jesus ever lived or walked on this earth, that Pentecostal moment came across the people, and they came to life with a rattle and a roar. Of course, Ezekiel was talking about the church of his day, a church that was dead, all but dead. Nothing left but a valley of dry bones. And of course, it begs the question, how are our bones? How are your bones doing today? Some of you say that you have old and achy bones. Some of you may have young and vibrant bones. But when church, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, is defined as the fastest declining denomination in Canada, it has a reputation of being filled with old, dry bones. My youngest grandson broke some bones again just a couple of weeks ago. He's the same grandson whose femur was broken a year and a half ago. This time he tripped at school and landed on a basketball with his forearm pressed against his chest. And he snapped both his, the ulna and the radius, he snapped them both, just clean. He's only 8 years old, and he's still, like we asked the question, is there something wrong with his bones? Are his bones brittle, or is he just accident prone? It's the same question that people have been asking of the Presbyterian Church for 40, 50 years. Is there something wrong with us? Why are we the fastest declining denomination in the in Canada? You know, this church in particular had a golden age. Some of you remember that golden age. I think in our anniversary we celebrated that at one time there were four worship services every Sunday, 3 in the morning, 1 in the evening. 3,600 people were a member of this congregation. 1,200 children in the church school. 1,200. Can you imagine? This place was bursting at the seams. You don't have that problem today. You don't have to squish over a little bit to allow the 1,200 kids to come in here. You don't have to squish over at 4 services to make sure that everybody who wants to come to church can come to church. No. In the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, even into the 70s, in some cases, even in the 80s, when the Presbyterian Church in Canada, some of you may remember, we were going to double in the 80s. Do you remember that? We were going to double in the 80s. Of course, that never happened. Around the late 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and 10s and now 20s, so for the last 40 years, the Presbyterian Church in Canada and most mainline denominations, indeed most churches and synagogues in Canada, have declined and declined rapidly. We could say that the church today is like a valley of dried bones. There are still some churches in Canada that are growing, some churches in Canada that are still vibrant. St. Andrews is one of them. As much as we're declining, we still have a strong vibrancy. Most churches in Canada that are still growing are immigrant churches, racialized minorities, who come from situations where God is still seen as powerfully important in the life and worship of people. But most Canadians, no, those days are gone. About 9% of Canadians now come to church. 9%. Most Canadians say, why in the world, you 9%, do you still come to church? Because church has been forgotten and set aside as unimportant. We've talked about this before. I mean, 40, 50 years ago, when I first started in ministry, ministers, clergy, were in the top 5 most trusted professions. We were usually 3, 4, or 5 back then. Now, no offense to lawyers, but lawyers are at 37. Do you know where preachers are? We're at 58. 58. Lots of reasons. But there are a lot of similarities to Ezekiel's time and our time, where church seems to be a lot of dry, dead bones. If I were to say to you that St. Andrew's in particular has an incredibly exciting future and will continue for years to come, some of you might say, Marty, I think you're drunk. But that is what I'm going to say to you today. Because there is a vision. It's not just my vision. It's the vision of a number of people who have been working hard over the last 12 years. And there is a vision in which we see dried and dead bones come to life. A great rattling in the Spirit of God, a great Pentecostal vision where the vision of Peter in the New Testament and the vision of Ezekiel in the Old Testament come together, bones that have been piling up, recognize that God is not finished, that God has not forgotten about us, that God has not forgotten about this church, about St. Andrew's. No, God is breathing on us all. The bones are rattling, but things will be different. Do you think I'm drunk? Some people have said so. But no, there is a strong vision to move forward. Things will be different, though, if as a congregation, if we need things to stay the same, if we want to hold on to the way things have always been, if we want to hold on to all of our traditions and our stature and our way of being in the world, if we hold on to all of those things, we will continue to be a church that ends up as a valley of dry bones. But there is a vision. There is a vision for those dead and dried bones to be a rattling and moving and having life, where the breath of God blows over us all. Yes, there is a vision. The leadership here at St. Andrew's has been working on that vision, and we need to prophesy. Remember when Ezekiel was talking to God in his vision, and Ezekiel said to God, well, if it is your will, perhaps these dead bones can come to life. And then God says back to Ezekiel, well, then prophesy. Prophets need to prophesy, even if prophets are thought to be drunk on wine or whatever else. They still need to prophesy. And those within this congregation, we need to prophesy. We need to recognize that this church will again be filled on a Sunday morning, but not the way it used to be. We're not going to have 3,600 Presbyterians come to church. No. We may have the church filled on a Sunday morning, but it's not going to be our church. It's not even going to be recognized as simply a Presbyterian church. It will be recognized as a gathering place for 3, 4, 5, 6 different congregations, 6 different churches utilizing this same place, some at the same time. It's already happening. We're speaking Presbyterian in here. They're speaking Lutheran over there. There's another church that will be speaking non-denominational, whatever language that is. And another congregation that's going to be speaking a different kind of Presbyterian, the Presbyterian Church or the Reformed Presbyterian Church of America. And yet another congregation that's speaking Hungarian. And yet another congregation that may be speaking Arabic and gathering together on a Saturday morning, a Syrian Orthodox congregation. The vision is a congregation, a church filled with people of various persuasions, but speaking the same language of love and care and compassion, of meeting the needs in a downtown core, of building stronger relationships with organizations to try to meet those downtown needs. Bodies, healthy bodies, flooding the church, walking up and down the halls of this church, using the facility regularly. A recognition that God is present in all that is happening because, and this is the big thing, because this church, this building, does not belong to the St. Andrew's people who have been here for 170 years. This is not your church any more than it's my church or the elders' church, the Sessions church. It's not a church that belongs to us. It's a church that belongs to God, a church to be used for God's purposes, a church that will and can be a vital institution within this downtown core to create a powerful witness of love, care, inclusion, and kindness. Are you catching that vision? We've been talking about it for over a year. Does it stir you? Does it excite you? Does it make you drunk? I'm asking that it make you drunk. The most powerful Pentecostal sermon that I ever heard was by a fellow by the name of William Willimon. He was a dean at Duke University, and just a great character. Character being the underlying word. He would say things that people would just kind of shake their heads at, and then, what are you saying, William? What are you saying? And he preached this sermon on Peter, and you know where Peter was prophesying and teaching and saw the tongues of fire, and there was excitement, and people from all over the place were talking to each other as if they were speaking in the same language, so caught up in the moment. And the bystanders said to Peter, "Peter, you're drunk. And all of those who are prophesying and talking, you're all drunk." And Peter said, "How can we be drunk? It's only 9 o'clock in the morning." So William Willimon told that story. And then he said, "You know what? Peter lied because he was drunk. He was drunk completely drunk, drunk in the Spirit of God. They were all drunk in the Spirit, for they had seen a vision of what could be, and they began in earnest to live out that vision in their very real reality. It was the birth of the church, and 3,000 people were added to that number that day. I hope, indeed, I pray that all of you, if you're not drunk right now, become drunk in this Pentecostal season, drunk with the possibilities of the Spirit all around, drunk so that you embrace the possibilities and work through the challenges that lie ahead when this building becomes filled with God's people, and us as Presbyterians begin to say, why are they doing things that way? No. Instead, we need to be drunk to see the possibilities of a God at work. So, the Pentecostal question for you today: how drunk are you willing to get? Thanks be to God. Amen.